On July 20th, 1969, the world woke up to the news that the United States had landed on the moon. Specifically, the 3 astronauts who took off on the Apollo 11 mission, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil Armstrong. The event caused a massive stir across the globe. America had claimed the throne of space exploration, especially since after Apollo 11, about 6 more manned missions were launched to the moon. But here's the strange part. Since then, and up until today, not a single human mission has returned to the moon. Naturally, this raised a lot of questions. Why, despite all the incredible scientific progress we have today, hasn't anyone gone back to the moon? Especially when the technology and equipment we have now should make the mission way easier than it was back then. To understand why no human missions have gone to the moon since 1972, we first need to ask, why did the Americans go there in the first place? Was it all for scientific research or the good of humanity? Actually, no. The real motivation behind sending people to the moon was to prove America's dominance over the Soviet Union on a global stage. After World War II ended, most countries were left devastated, but 2 nations stood strong, the United States and the Soviet Union. From that point on, the 2 were in constant competition, each trying to prove who would lead the world. And because both had been allies during the war and had agreements and treaties in place, a direct military clash between them wasn't an option. That's how the Cold War began. Each country tried to outshine the other in science, technology, and culture. And one of the biggest arenas for this competition was space. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. It stayed in orbit for about 3 months and marked a major leap in space technology. Just a month later, in November that same year, they sent a dog named Laika into space aboard another spacecraft to orbit Earth. They equipped the capsule with sensors to monitor her heart rate, blood pressure, and more, to study the effects of space on living organisms. Done yet? Not even close. In 1959, they sent a robotic probe called Luna 3, which captured images of the far side of the moon, the side we never see from Earth, due to a phenomenon called tidal locking. Then in April 1961, they made history again. They put a human, pilot Yuri Gagarin, into a spacecraft and had him orbit Earth for about 100 minutes. He became the first human in space. Sure, America had its own milestones. They launched satellites and even sent a chimpanzee into orbit. But overall, the Soviet Union was clearly leading the space race. America was falling behind badly. They needed a major win to turn things around. And that's when John F. Kennedy came into the picture. He had just become president a few months earlier, and things weren't looking good for him at all, both at home and on the world stage. To make matters worse, he had recently embarrassed America by authorizing a failed invasion of Cuba, an operation meant to overthrow the communists there. It was a disaster. Kennedy and the American people desperately needed something bold to restore their confidence. So, in his famous speech on September 12, 1962, Kennedy said, "We choose to go to the moon." He promised that the U.S. would send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. He then requested full support, funding, equipment, and political backing for NASA to achieve this goal by the year 1970, and that was the turning point. The Apollo missions became a matter of national pride for America. They believed this was their chance to reclaim global leadership. They were determined to succeed, no matter the cost. They were even willing to endure harsh economic conditions to make it happen. Apollo wasn't just a mission, it was America's national project. To put it in perspective, in 1965, NASA's budget made up 4.3% of the entire U.S. federal budget. Adjusted for today's value, that's around $264 billion allocated for Apollo alone. And that's not even counting all the political, governmental, and media support they received. But what does all of this have to do with the fact that no one has gone back to the moon again? First of all, NASA's current budget represents only about 0.5% of the total U.S. federal budget. That means NASA's budget in the 1960s was about 9 times larger than it is today. and that number simply isn't enough to fund safe missions to the moon. At the same time, the United States had already proven its dominance in the space race a long time ago. The matter was basically settled in its favor, especially considering that the Soviet Union, its main rival, was dismantled back in 1991. So, the Americans have no reason to spend massive amounts of money again just to go to the moon. I mean, what are they trying to prove? Today, they can spend way less and still achieve major accomplishments. Just imagine, the Apollo missions we talked about cost the equivalent of $264 billion in today's money. Meanwhile, the James Webb Space Telescope, which launched in 2021 and made global headlines, cost only $10 billion, and even that wasn't entirely funded by the US alone. That project was a collaboration between 14 countries, including Austria, Belgium, Canada, Germany, and the UK. So, from a purely economic standpoint, sending humans to the moon again is simply not worth it. Now, let's make something clear so people truly understand. Sending humans to the moon is completely different from sending robots. Since 1972, robotic missions to the moon have never stopped. Every few years, a country launches a spacecraft or probe there. In 2007, for example, Japan launched the space probe Selene. A year later, in 2008, India launched its spacecraft Chandrayaan-1. Then, 5 years later, in 2013, China sent the Chang'e 3 spacecraft, which successfully landed on the surface of the moon. 5 more years passed, and in 2018, they launched Chang'e 4, and in 2020, they launched Chang'e 5, which managed to collect samples of moon rocks and soil and bring them back to Earth. So in short, space missions didn't stop completely. Only manned missions did. Robotic missions are relatively easy and come with fewer risks, but human missions are a different story altogether. They require a mountain of money and extreme effort to ensure ultra-precise safety measures, like maintaining cabin temperature, pressure control, shielding from radiation, supplying oxygen, food, and water throughout the entire mission, however long it may be. All of these things make human spaceflight far more complicated. Even something as simple as managing the astronaut's waste inside the spacecraft is complex, and despite all these precautions, the rocket itself could still explode, or the spacecraft could malfunction in space, and instead of the mission being a political win for the country, it becomes a catastrophe and a scandal. Not to mention, people would die. That's exactly what happened in 1970 with Apollo 13. The spacecraft's oxygen tank exploded and its power generators failed. The 3 astronauts on board were at serious risk of dying, so once the spacecraft reached the moon's orbit, the mission was canceled and they didn't land. They returned to Earth and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, which was a major event at the time. Now, finally, there's something really important to mention. All space agencies today follow a completely different strategic mindset compared to the past. They now believe that all the money spent on the Apollo missions during those one-time trips was a wasteful use of funds and technology. In other words, that money could have been used far better. Instead of spending all those billions just to send a few humans, they could have built a full system for transporting humans to space, like a space transit network. Imagine a station on Earth, a second station in space, and rockets and spacecraft that can make round trips, not just one-offs. With all the money they burned on Apollo, they could have built a system like that. But of course, nobody thought that way. All they cared about was beating the Soviet Union as fast as possible. Now, however, that's exactly what space agencies are aiming for, and not just government agencies, but also private companies like SpaceX. They're trying to build spacecraft that can take people to space and bring them back over and over again in a sustainable way. We could even make you a full video about how SpaceX is revolutionizing the space industry today. Let us know in the comments if you want us to do that. That's it for now. Who made it this far? If you're still here, you're the real MVP. Leave us a like before you go so we can see how many made it to the end.